Okay, so welcome to the Race and Racism in Global South seminar. Unfortunately, we've had a little bit of a problem with the link that was sent out earlier, so I know more people will be joining as we go along. But let me welcome you all on behalf of the co-conveners, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves very quickly. My name is Humair Iqtidar, and I teach at the Department of Political Economy at King's College London, and this seminar series is being hosted by the Global South Research Group at King's College at the Department of Political Economy. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the first seminar in the series. And the series, as you know, is part of a larger interest and an attempt at engaging with race and racism in the Global South beyond the Euro-American context, and really thinking about both empirical and theoretical insights that one can generate from that engagement. Before I introduce the presenters, who we are very excited to have with us today, let me quickly ask my co-conveners to introduce themselves. Sadaf and Lawrence, if you would like to go ahead. Sadaf, would you like to go first?
Sure. I'm Sadaf Aziz. I'm based at the Lahore University of Management Sciences at the law school here. My primary areas of research and scholarship are comparative constitutional law, constitutional history, as well as some critical legal studies. So I'm very much, grateful for the people who've agreed to present their work in this seminar, which I think is really fascinating and interesting. And from this position in the Global South is not spoken or theorized sufficiently, the issue of race and racism. Thank you.
Thank you. Lawrence?
Hi, I'm Lawrence Hamilton. I'm located currently in Johannesburg. My chair is between University of the Witwatersrand and the University of Cambridge. Yeah, and I just like to support what Sadaf just said, and also to thank Humera for initiating this wonderful idea for the Global South in general, but for our understanding of race and racism as well. As Trevor Noah said, I think the other day, it's particularly relevant for South Africans because we're understandably very good at talking about race, but we haven't been very good at doing much about it, race and racism. So I would hope that this would give us some kind of platform for that. Thanks.
With a quote from the great Trevor Noah to start us off. Thanks for that, Lawrence. He is brilliant in the way that he's able to pull together all these strands together with a lot of humor. So now to the presenters. It is a source of immense pleasure to start the series with recent research that Dr. Monica Moreno Figeuroa and Professor Peter Wade have been undertaking. Monica is a sociologist based at the University of Cambridge and her research brings together three strands. One is the lived experience of race and racism. She is also at the same time has written very interesting and important work about feminist theory and racism. And she brings with it a real interest in visual methodology and collaborative research. And actually, with that in mind, it's really useful to mention and important to mention the cooperative that Monica has set up with colleagues in America and in Mexico, which is called the Collective Coopera. And Monica might like to talk a bit more about that later on. Similarly, it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Peter Wade, who has been a trailblazer in terms of research and ethnographic engagement with race and racism. Starting with his research in Colombia, he's branched out and brought really interesting comparisons to bear, not just in the Latin American or South American context, but also thinking about what North America and European debates and what we can learn within, say, the global North from these experiences within South America. He has several books, but the most recent one is Degrees of Mixture, Degrees of Freedom. And so it's a real pleasure to welcome you both to this event. I see that a lot more people are joining slowly, but as I said in the beginning, unfortunately, there's been a problem with the link. We do have more than 85 people registered for the seminar, and so I'm very excited given the interest in this conversation. We will be recording this event, and we will, unfortunately, if other people are not able to join today, we will hopefully be making this available to a much wider audience. I do see now that a lot more people are able to join in, so that's fantastic. So Monica and Peter, over to you for about 25 minutes. I'm sorry that we're having to cut the time short a bit, but it would be great to leave some time for questions. And I will give you a reminder at about 20 minutes now, just to remind you the time. So over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my PowerPoint, our PowerPoint. Okay, so can you see that okay, the presentation?
Yes, coming
Okay.
through.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us to this presentation. We're very excited to have this global conversation on race and racism. And what we're presenting here is the product of a research project called Latin American Anti-Racism in a Post-Racial Age. I just wanted to show you all the people that participate in this project. And it's a comparative project looking at anti-racist action and discourse in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Mexico that we developed, Peter and I led it. And I just wanted you to have a sense that what we're saying here is just it's not only our own work, but it comes from the work, the reflections, the process, the field work that we did together as a team. And it's a big group. And this project, as I was saying, I will just tell you very quickly, was looking at this, in a way, looking at having a comparative and relational approach to exploring these practices and discourses of anti-racism. It involved 24 cases that were more intensive or in detail with a variety of more contextual cases. We produced, we were very interested in looking at both indigenous peoples and Black peoples organizing strategies and anti-racist group work. I think maybe we should ask people to put their microphone for a minute, to close the microphone. And we were also looking at the variety of research areas from state institutions, social movements, activists, NGOs and legal cases. And we did this over a 9-month period. So what we are presenting here is comes from this work that it will be this year, hopefully published in a book that we've called Against Racism. So I turn now to Pete. Oh no, yeah.
Yes. Okay, thanks, Monica. So our project took place in the context of about 20 or 30 years now of multiculturalist reform in Latin America, which started in the early 90s. And right across Latin America, there was a whole raft of constitutional and legislative reforms that recognized indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples and sometimes their land rights and different kinds of rights. So it's very much a rights regime, very much recognition of cultural difference and so on. And gradually, it became clear that racialized inequalities were not really being addressed here. So cultural difference was being recognized, but as is often the case with multiculturalist regimes, there was less attention to structural inequalities of race. And in that context, there has been in the last sort of 10, especially the last 5 years, a gradual turn towards anti-racism, towards recognizing the structural issues around racial inequality. But in that context, what we were looking at in our project was there were very diverse ways of talking, or sometimes not talking, about racism and anti-racism. Sometimes people, organizations, individuals were very explicit about racism, about its existence, and about the need to put it front and center of their agenda. sometimes organizations were much more indirect in the way that they referenced or talked about racism. We also found a good deal of variety in terms of the way that people talked about racism as a kind of individual matter of individual attitudes and behaviors and so on, or that they looked at or thought about it in more structural dimensions. There's some clattering going on in the back. Perhaps people could mute their mics. There's some plates being rattled in the back there. Monica,
Yes,
can you...
I actually, let me second that, because I've tried, I've not been able to figure out how to mute everybody else without muting you as well, Peter.
Okay,
so
don't worry. I think it's fine.
I can only request that everybody else mute themselves, please.
Okay. So why are these questions interesting? Why are they important questions? The way in which people talk about racism is related.
JJ, I'm not saying JJ is a good person. Clearly a bad person, or a person who does bad things sometimes, like you said, because he often bullies, he often is very...
Maybe it'll silence everyone who made and then open the microphone.
I'm not saying JJ is overall a good, well-rounded person. Not even defending...
How do I do that, Monica?
I'm saying, simple specifically, JJ in touch. Verbally, physically.
At the top, as a host, you can mute everyone.
Yeah, well, I don't seem to have that option, actually.
If you make me host, I can do it.
Okay. Sorry, and meanwhile.
Yeah, we can open then just.
So how, sorry, this is new to me. So how do I make you host?
You go to the participant list, and where it says more,
I see.
On my name, it says more. You can say make co-host or host.
Yeah, okay.
You can make me. And
co-host, yeah, got it. You're co-host now.
Okay.
Mute all without muting.
Shall I carry on? Because I think
Yes.
The problem has been solved, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll carry on. So the question is, how does one best tackle racism, racialized inequality, racialized injustice? And simplifying a bit, there are two basic possibilities, I suppose we could say. On the one hand, you see race and racism especially as something that is sort of incidental to capitalism, liberalism, modern Western society. It's just a kind of an aberration, an anachronism, a blip that will be overcome with time. On the other hand, you can see race and racism as things that are constitutive of capitalism, liberalism, and modernity. That is to say, those things couldn't exist without racism. And this is the approach that is taken by a whole variety of theoretical positions, post-colonialism, critical race theory, Afro-pessimism, and so on. Now, in both those approaches, it would seem on the surface that racism is something that would need to be named in order to combat it. So even if you see it as incidental, you might think, oh, well, first thing we've got to do is call it out, name it, identify it as such. In the second approach, especially, seeing racism as constitutive also tends to set the bar rather high for action, because if you have to change everything, if you have to change capitalist relations, if you have to change liberal political orders and so on, in order to address fundamentally the problem of racism, then you're asking quite a lot of any organization or any kind of reform. So in our project, we were thinking about working with what Carolyn Pedwell calls an understanding of the imbrication of the revolutionary in the routine. That is to say that you can look at, as well as looking at revolutionary proposals about how to combat racism, we could also look at more kind of everyday routine behaviors and ideas and processes. And what we found in our work was a huge diversity of organizations and who took very different approaches to racism, to injustice, and how to cope with them. So in the end, we thought, well, we wanted to take an inclusive view here, so to not dismiss certain types of organizations and certain kinds of agendas because they weren't radical enough, or because they didn't necessarily talk directly and openly and explicitly about racism. But at the same time, we wanted to take a kind of critical approach, which didn't just say, oh, well, you can do anything, any kind of action is okay. So we need to still have some kind of critical and radical vision that does see race and racism as constitutive of capitalism and liberalism, but doesn't necessarily dismiss initiatives and enterprises that don't address the fundamental structures of capitalism and liberalism. Next slide, please, Monica. Thank you. So we did come across some organizations, and here's an example, that did talk about racism and put it right at the center and the front of their strategies and their agendas. This is a Colombian organization called Chao Racismo. And they also took a kind of, in some ways, a structural approach, because their main challenge for them was to challenge the equation of black equals poor, negro equals pobre. So that is a kind of a structural approach in essence. And they did in fact address employment issues via a kind of certification program that they had, where they would issue certificates to businesses that had inclusive employment practices. And they also had programs of kind of youth directed action where they provided opportunities for youth to youth to get involved in ways that would avoid them being drawn into a cycle of violence and so on, which is, as you probably know, very common in Colombia. But at the end of the day, what this organization was fundamentally about was a kind of middle-class entrism, which is that they wanted to sell an image of blackness as fashionable, sexy, and chic. So they would make a point of, for example, of going to a beauty contest and getting beauty queens or candidates to wear their t-shirts, or at least hold them up, as you can see. So in many ways, people would say, well, they're not radical enough. They're not addressing the kind of basic underlying structural inequalities of capitalism and so on. And that's true, but we didn't think that it was therefore necessary to dismiss them out of hand. Next slide. But we were also interested, I mean, that was an organization that did put racism front and center of its agenda, but we were also interested in struggles that didn't foreground racism in that very explicit way. And we coined the term alternative grammars of anti-racism to kind of capture this. For example, one of these alternative grammars of anti-racism is what I've called a racially aware class consciousness, which is a kind of basically a class-based consciousness, but one that is aware somehow that race is part of the picture. So this is quite common in mestizo societies like Latin American societies, where senses of racial belonging, racialized belonging and racialized identities are not always very clear. There are sort of multiple racialized identities, and it's not always clear, it's not just black and indigenous and white. There's all kinds of mixed race identities in the middle, which can sometimes blur the picture around racism. And these are also societies that are simultaneously stratified by race and class. So that the poorer you are, the darker skinned and more indigenous and blacker you're likely to be. So these are societies in which a racially aware class consciousness is quite a common feature. Next slide, please. So what are the strengths and the risks of these, what we call alternative anti-racist grammars? Well, the strength is precisely that because they address the intersection between race and class, they have automatically a kind of structural focus. You can't see racism as just a question of a few bad apples, some people with kind of aberrant ideas, etc. You've automatically got a structural focus. And it's inclusive in the sense that we discovered that there was lots of indigenous organizations that weren't really comfortable with talking about racism or race and anti-racism. They weren't comfortable with that language. So it was hard for them to say, yeah, we are an anti-racist organization, racism is our main problem. But if you use these kinds of indirect or inexplicit, tacit, alternative anti-racist grammars, it was easier for them to identify with that. But at the same time, the issue of racism doesn't disappear off the table. You're not saying, oh, and it's not about racism at all, it's all about class. You are saying it's partly about class, but there's also a way in which racism enters into the picture, as we'll see in the examples that we're going to present. But the risks of these alternative anti-racist grammars are, of course, that they will underestimate the very constitutive and integral role that racism and racialized inequality play in overall systems of hierarchy and inequality. And they will tend to miss precisely the things that are characteristic of racism, which are the way it naturalizes disadvantage and inequality, and the way it dehumanizes the targets of inequality.
Okay, so I will continue now, and what we will give you now is some examples of alternative grammars of anti-racism from Mexico and Ecuador, which are what we call different inflections on, one, the way in which racism features in the political agenda of a given organization, and two, how explicitly racism is named and not named. So we consider what productive possibilities might be opened by a radical perspective on racism in each of the cases. And we end by questioning the assumption that the explicit naming of racism per se is a sign of advancing anti-racist work. And what we will suggest is that the employment of strategic language and awareness of structural racism has distinct advantages for anti-racist practice. So in this sense, for example, struggles for safety, political power, and land can have anti-racist dimensions. So I'm going to start with the first case, and this is the one of Wimbi, a community in the Pacific coastal region of Ecuador that has been ancestrally occupied by Black and some indigenous communities. For centuries, but increasingly in the last few decades, the area has been subject to exploitation by outside interests, mainly white mestizo, national and international interests. And this has been for natural resources, minerals and timber, but also for agro-industrial production, particularly palm oil plantations and some shrimp farms. So members of the local communities are often involved in these enterprises, either as workers in different modalities. It could also be as small entrepreneurs linked to the incoming businesses, and they might sell land or rights to resources or concede them in exchange for other benefits like road constructions or something like that. However, conflicts emerge over land grabs and over environmental destruction, and particularly the use and contamination of water and the destruction of the forest. Resistance by local communities is thus principally about land and environment. And that's why we call it the alternative grammar of the environment and land for this case. For local activists, the resistance that they managed to kind of enact and what we will call their anti-racist work includes using legal instruments, including rights to the titling of ancestral lands. They mobilize Ecuador's ombudsman or public defender, and they use alliances with the Catholic Church and environmentalist NGOs. In all of this, racism and anti-racism are not often mentioned explicitly by locals, by allies, or even by some social science analysts of the situation. And when interviewees mention the word, it is often in context of direct discrimination rather than structural processes. Yet there is some underlying awareness among locals of structural issues linked to their racialized condition. Although in our interviews, it's mostly among a certain educate and activist group. So here are some examples. You know, they would say things that they do this because we're Black. It seems they want to eliminate us just because it's only with Black and indigenous peoples that you can see such abuse of our rights. The palm company says we have won against really important people. Are we going to lose to these Blackies? You know, it has been said that the state does not care about the lives of Black people. You know, in the class of poor people, the most fucked up of all is the Black. So this work kind of gives us a sense of when, you know, this specific terminology comes in. And the question of Blackness and thus implicit racism also arises in other ways. First, you have the issue of land that can be claimed as ancestral lands of an Afro-Ecuadorian community. Even if this relates to multiculturalism, it still foregrounds a category for which racialized difference could be made evident, and indeed is made evident by some. Secondly, outsiders often portray the region as a whole as inferior, that is underdeveloped or uncivilized, because of its Black and indigenous population. Therefore, there is an underlying racialization linked to the historical geography and moral topography of the country, which creates and sustains, on the one hand, a structural link between underdevelopment and Blackness and indigeneity, and on the other hand, constructs an image of the region as a place open to exploitation by any means necessary in order to make a profit. So what are the implications of this? On the one hand, pursuing land and well-being as a local or regional group may be productive in gaining ground in a material sense. In a context of mestizaje or in other contexts of the post-racial denial and the legitimation of racism, it can be an effective tactic to maximize the legitimacy of claims and struggles in the eyes of others. On the other hand, it leaves implicit a key factor in the suite of mechanisms that reproduce disadvantage and block struggle. So racism comes into and out of focus, although in this case, it was rather less in focus than what we will see in the next case of Mexico. There was ambiguity about the intersection of race and class. It doesn't coincide completely, but it did overlap. We see a lesser awareness of structural racism alongside a good deal of clarity about the unequal exploitation of land and environmental consequences, a clarity that is nevertheless tinged with a sense that the racialized position of the area's inhabitants is somehow involved in this inequality. So this refers to the term that Peter was talking about, of being this racially aware class consciousness. So notably in this case, when racism is talked about in this context, it leads directly to a structural analysis of the topic, going beyond individual discriminations and stigmatizations. As with the case we will see next, it invites us, indeed obliges us, to consider the whole racialized power structure, in this case of Ecuador. Okay, so now back to Pete.
Okay, so the second example is from Mexico, the Congreso Nacional Indígena, the Indigenous National Congress. And this is an alternative grammar that focuses on political power, especially in the electoral domain. So in 2017, the Congreso Nacional Indígena created the Consejo de Gobierno Indígena, the Council of Indigenous Governance, in the context of the presidential elections, and they were trying to get an indigenous candidate onto the slate of presidential candidates. So they launched this Nahua woman, Maria de Jesus Patricio, also known as Marichuy, as their candidate. And there was a big campaign in order to try and collect enough signatures for her to be on the presidential slate. Next. Thank you. So the CNI, the Congreso Nacional Indígena, is a very kind of radical, clearly anti-capitalist organization. Its roots come from the early 90s, sort of the Zapatista rebellion in southern Mexico, which was a kind of Marxist, anti-capitalist, anti-globalization organization. So that's what their basic discourse is. And in that respect, they speak clearly on behalf of what they call los de abajo, the ones at the bottom of society. And they say things like, we hear the pain of people like us, of all colors, who are the lower Mexico. And they say it is not only the racism of the political structure that did not allow our proposal for Marichuy to appear on the electoral ballot because they didn't collect enough signatures, because if those who oppose capitalism's destruction of the world shared amongst themselves slanted blue and red eyes, i.e. were racially and ethnically diverse, public policy and supposed democracy would still be made to exclude them. So it doesn't matter what color you are, if you're poor and you're anti-capitalist, you're going to be excluded. So in line with that, we found there was only a kind of occasional reference to racism, often in a kind of list alongside other things like marginality and discrimination and so on. The word racismo itself only appeared 9 times in 4 years of their blog posts and news on their website. But against that, there was clearly a very strong sense of indigeneity, even though they said they were appealing to everybody. there was constant reference to los pueblos indígenas, the indigenous peoples, and the autonomy that was one of their main goals and priorities was based on the space of the indios, of the indigenous people that we are. So there was clearly a very strong sense of racialized subalternity, which was below the surface, but was nevertheless present. And that particular aspect was made much clearer in the context of Marichui's electoral campaign, where there was a good deal of racist backlash on social media, specifically Twitter, where people posted things like, I would vote for Marichui. You can see she has experience in cleaning Mexico. That is to say, she looks like a domestic worker, like the kind of people who work in people's houses. Therefore, is experienced in cleaning Mexico, and kind of playing with the idea of cleaning Mexico in terms of cleaning up corruption. But, identifying her clearly as working class, indigenous, female domestic worker. That Marichui looks like the woman who does the cleaning in my house. Similar kind of thing. This constant riffing on the idea of her gender, her class, and her race at the same time. So, if you, in one sense, then reference to los de abajo, people at the bottom, kind of backgrounds that evident racism that you saw in those social media posts. But at the same time, there was some kind of sense in the discourse of the CNI that race and the fact of being indigenous had something to do with it. And that racially aware class, and in this case, gendered class consciousness, can build coalitions. So it wasn't only if you're an indigenous woman who was a domestic worker, would you feel outraged or indignant at those kinds of comments on social media. You could be a dark-skinned mestizo woman who's also a domestic servant, and you'd feel also equally offended by those kinds of comments. So that implied a sort of structural perspective on the racialized power structure of Mexico. There's no way you could talk about being indigenous and not talk about race and class at the same time. So the Los de Abajo is a kind of structural figure that automatically implies both race and class, and always has done. So in sum, then, we have here a kind of awareness of structural racism in the background, but with a kind of ambivalent use of the discourse of racism itself. Okay, so to conclude, one might think that the recent focus on racism, that turn to anti-racism that I noted at the beginning, which we've seen in the last 5-10 years, could be, and often has been seen in Latin America, in mestizo societies, as a good thing, because part of the whole problem of Latin America is denial and minimization of racism. So the first step has often been, has been traditionally, historically, let's identify racism, let's identify it, document it, make it clear, name it, and so on. But actually, a specific focus on racism can lead to some fairly limited outcomes. So it's led, in Latin America, to lots of legislation outlawing racism and outlawing racist acts. But we all know that those kinds of legislative initiatives are useful, so not to be dismissed, but they can also be limited because often the bar, the level of proof that's needed to carry through an accusation of racist behavior to conviction and to prison sentences and so on, that bar is very high. So the alternative, or one alternative amongst many others, is to address these kind of race-class intersections with a structural perspective rather than just calling racism out and naming it as such. These alternative grammars can address these basic structures of inequality and are also at the same time racially aware. So it's not as if racism just disappears off the map. And I would argue that these sorts of alternative grammars can provide a useful foothold for anti-racism in a mestizo society, where it's often very difficult to talk explicitly about racism, and it can alienate some of the people who are actually the victims of racism.
Sorry. However, there are risks here for underestimating the importance of the integral role racism and racialized inequality plays in structuring hierarchy and inequality as a whole. WIMBY locals are unevenly aware of the historical intersections of race and class via colonialism, which have over the centuries produced the durable and often inflexible layers and accumulations that constitute today's social structures. Even CNI people, the Congreso Nacional Indígena, who often deploy a discourse that is explicitly aware of these things, often also put them in a Marxist frame that reduces racism to an ideological tool at the service of capitalism, rather than seeing it historically constitutive of capitalism and liberal political orders. So we argue that it is worth exploiting the current turn to anti-racism in Latin America and working with a politically radical horizon in view, but also that it's important to highlight just how much racism has been and still is integral to the fabric of the class system. That is to highlight racialized dimension of inequality and of struggles and the systemic character of racialized disadvantage. This, we argue, is a worthwhile goal in itself. In working in this way, moreover, other effects may be entailed. For example, Black and Indigenous alliances. Emphasizing racism is often seen as divisive and causing separation between Black people who tend to more easily think in terms of racism and Indigenous people who often tend to avoid the concept. But grasping racism in its structural dimensions and its intersections with class can provide a common platform on which to mobilize. And this could be around land, resources, power, security, well-being, etc. It can also let us think of mestizos, these majorities of mixed race people in Latin American countries, as allies. The same approach can also give them a way of seeing how they are implicated in the system as people who are oppressed by the intersections of race and class, even if they are not Indigenous or Black, and simultaneously as people who might sometimes benefit from and sometimes reproduce those same intersections. Talk in terms of racism and racial disadvantage as structural issues, not just individual acts of stigmatization or discrimination, can really help wider claims for social justice and change. So thank you. We will conclude there. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Monica and Peter. And as people gather their thoughts for questions, let me just say that what I'll try and do is collect a few questions so that you have some time. I mean, it's useful for you as well, perhaps, to have a few questions to take away. And I can, so please use the hand raise function to let me know if you're willing, if you're looking to ask a question. But may I start the conversation by asking you to perhaps clarify a bit more how what you are saying is different from the concept of intersectionality. So how are these, alternative grammars of racism that do take structural mechanisms into consideration, how are they different from the concept of intersectionality? Okay. If I don't see any hands right now, if you want to start with that question and I can collect hands. Oh, there are actually hands, sorry.
Yeah, I can. Shall I have a crack, Monica?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or shall we collect some questions? Because I see that Brian and Lawrence have questions and I'm just conscious that we are running over time. So, and Sadaf as well. So shall we start with you, Brian, and then Lawrence and Sadaf?
Okay, thank you, Mera. My question is about the utility of the analytical framework that you're advancing. And it seems to me that in a way, you're evaluating your own framework in terms of its potential political utility. And if one takes that approach, which is, well, will this type of analysis work when it's mobilized politically, or won't it? Or will this one work, which is, if you like, a way of measuring the value of the framework you're using? Presumably the answer to that question would be an empirical one based on whatever kind of jurisdiction, state or country you're looking at. And so you'd need to say to yourself, well, this framework might work in this way in this country, and it might work in terms of mobilization in this way in another country. So in other words, the utility of the framework would be dependent on the empirical situation to which it's being applied if one's looking for political outcomes as a result.
Lawrence?
Many thanks. That was fascinating. My question is just a question around clarification as well. And I just wanted to know whether there was it's about context too, whether there was an important rural-urban distinction in your work. You obviously, in the time you had, you weren't able to let us know exactly where these the various contexts you're talking about came from. In the South African context, a focus on explicit use of anti-racism or racist tropes would actually depend upon quite significantly on whether one was rural or urban. So I just wondered if, to use your language, the alternative grammars of anti-racism would change significantly between a rural or an urban context.
And finally, Sadaf, I saw your hand raised, but then also go down, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can ask the question, but I was just interested, of course, that they should have enough time to answer the questions that are being posed. But so quickly, the question is this, that, you know, in the various movements that have been highlighted in the alternative grammars of anti-racism, there is very much a fusion between class-based, or, you know, oppression on grounds of class and race together. And I'm just wondering if also there, you know, the presenters can speak to instances where in fact they're cleaved apart, because then a different grammar of anti-racism may also be visible. And I'm thinking particularly, I mean, these are historical episodes of, you know, the apprehension of the role of racialized difference under colonial rule, things of this sort, where in fact, as you know, certain let's say groups rose up, you know, sort of in terms of economic well-being, to levels of well-being that approximated those of, you know, white rulers or whatever the case might be, the ruling class. That's when racism also made itself ever more apparent through the various other closures and mechanisms of exclusion that were operationalized. So I'm wondering if and how, and I realized, of course, in the longer trajectory that they've highlighted of, you know, different non-racialized identities being merged into the nation. There's evidence of that, but I'm wondering if now in the contemporary period that can also be spoken to. Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead. And we'll, if we have time for another round of questions, we'll take them, but let's have your answers now.
You go, Pete.
Okay, yeah, I can start. So what's the difference between alternative grammars of anti-racism and intersectionality? Well, obviously they are connected, but what we are trying to get at with the alternative grammars of anti-racism is the way in which the talk about racism is backgrounded, so that you're not, you know, if you're talking about intersectionality, then you're talking about race and class, let's say, or usually race and gender are the things that are classically, you know, associated with that concept of intersectionality. But in those things, you've got sort of race and gender, they're both equally present. Whereas what we're talking about is situations in which people might be talking about, let's say, becoming a presidential candidate or getting land or cleaning up the river or avoiding police violence. And in that, they might not be talking explicitly about racism and so on. So for example, you know, the whole Black Lives Matter movement and the kind of the reaction to police violence in North America and here, racism is absolutely front and center of that whole thing. Whereas if you go to Brazil, where there's also high levels of police homicide of young black men, and you know, mothers form these networks and movements to contest that violence, actually racism isn't sort of front and center of what they do. They're aware that the fact that they're black has something to do with the fact that they are also the victims of police violence. and that they're poor and live in the, in informal settlements and so forth. But actually they don't, it isn't something that goes onto their banners. That they go into the streets and mobilize and have protests and so on, but you don't see the word racism written on their banners very much. So that's what we're trying to get at. And also I'd say, when you talk about intersectionality, as I said just now, the classic intersection is between race and gender. And race and class, somehow that was a debate that was going on in the 1970s with sort of Marxism and, which is more important and so on. So looking at the way they're actually woven together in the same way that race and gender can be woven together is, I think, something that is still of interest. Monica, do you want to, shall I pass over to you?
Yeah, I wanted to say about the urban-rural distinction. I think the cases we looked at were definitely in both areas, and I don't think necessarily the urban or the rural was an issue in terms of how much they were using alternative or implicit grammars of anti-racism. I think it was more like, because they vary. There were ones that were very explicit about what they were doing. They vary across. And what we want to get at is how much both the rural and the urban was integrated into their discourses and their practices, rather than it being distinct for their allowing them to elaborate on that. I don't think it's necessarily an issue of knowledge, as we saw, knowledge or awareness or contagion, but in some cases it was more strategic. It was a decision. In other cases it was just not prominent. The fight for life, the struggle for land was what was at the forefront, and it nevertheless had anti-racist effects because of the subjects who were leading these struggles, but also the results and processes that were elicited through that. And I guess that also, I leave it like that. I don't know if I can, I don't know if you have something else to add. I wasn't very clear about the last question, I have to confess, and the utility of the analytical framework and how they change. I guess I didn't quite understand the question.
I think I can say something about Brian's question. Yeah, you're right. I think the political utility is the measure. It's like the key thing that we were interested in was how effective are different strategies of anti-racist intervention and mobilization and so on. And obviously that's a very hard thing to measure. How do you measure the efficacy? That's a very long-term process. How efficacious is something like Chao Racismo versus the Congreso Nacional Indígena? Those are quite sort of disparate examples, and as you rightly point out, they're very context dependent. So you have to look at what actually happens in each particular case, but also you have to look at it over a long period of time to see what the impact is of these different strategies. So I think the key thing that we were interested in is being inclusive about the fact that all these different ways of addressing racism, even ones that don't necessarily mention racism explicitly, or ones that do mention racism explicitly, but then treat it as a kind of, in a middle class entrist sort of way. We don't want to just dismiss those things, either because they're not radical enough, or because they don't name racism clearly enough. We know that naming racism is important, and we know that being radical is important, but that doesn't mean to say that these other kinds of initiatives don't have something to offer. So I think that's the kind of the key thing that we were trying to pin down. To address Sadaf's question, one of the key examples of where race and class are clearly pulled apart in North America and Europe, where you have a working class and to some extent a middle class increasingly, that are clearly where white people are the majority and black people are the minority. And that is not the case in Latin America, where the working classes in general are darker skinned, and the upper classes are much lighter skinned and more European looking. So there are sort of particular instances where they do get pulled apart a little bit, which is where you have middle class, educated black and indigenous people, which is an increasing trend. So yeah, there are instances where that happens, and generally, I think, generalizing quite a lot, that experience of being middle class and then experiencing racism, the exclusion that you do experience in Latin America if you're a middle class Black or indigenous person, especially if you're explicit about your Blackness and indigenous identity, that tends to produce more racial literacy, if you like, more kind of awareness that racism is a problem. So I guess that's yeah, kind of one of the findings, I suppose.
Thank you very much. You have done a fantastic job of staying within the time, even when we started late and with all the disruptions. We do have a minute and a half. If there are any burning questions that anybody would like to ask at this stage, this is your chance. Okay. In that case, all that remains for me to do is to thank you, Monica and Peter, for this really invigorating presentation and sharing this new research, which actually does, it's a great start to the seminar series, precisely because it helps us think about both the empirical context, but also the conceptual repertoire and conceptual works that we bring to thinking about race and racism in the Global South. So thank you very much, and looking forward to keeping this conversation going in the forthcoming seminars. The next seminar is in 2 weeks' time, and we have Aisha Omar, who's I see present in the seminar right now, and she will be presenting her research, and she's currently based in South Africa. So we're very much looking forward to that conversation as well. Thank you all, and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time.